Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. If I can ask you all to have a seat, that would be wonderful. My name is Karen Crabtree. I'm the president of the board for the Detroit Lakes Area League of Women Voters. I want to thank you for coming today. We have multiple co-sponsors that were able to bring this event to you today, including Becker County Energize, the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association, the Becker County Coalition of Lakes Association, the Isaac Walton League. So thank all of you for bringing this to Detroit Lakes area today. We want to welcome Senator Eakin and Representative Marquardt to come on up. Thank you for coming to Detroit Lakes to be with the community today. And with that, we're going to ask people, if you have a question, if you could please line up along the wall on this side over here. We have one microphone, so we'll try to be very respectful of everybody's time. But in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Deanna Sinclair, who's our moderator today. Deanna has lived in Detroit, and I have no, oh, there it is. She's lived in Detroit Lakes since 1989. She's married to Jim and has 2 children. She loves hot air ballooning and would tell you all about it, I'm sure, if you asked. I asked her why she joined the League of Women Voters, and she said really she wanted to get more involved and understand more about the issues and help the general public learn more to help our community. So welcome to Deanna, and thank you all, the media audience, for being here today.
Well, good evening and welcome. I want to thank the City of Detroit Lakes for hosting this event here at the City Hall and tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a 99-year-old nonprofit membership organization that encourages active and informed participation in government and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League does not endorse candidates for office or political parties. Membership in League of Women Voters is open to all, both men and women. To learn more, ask any of our members here tonight or visit our website, www.lwvmn.org. It's listed on the program if there's any handouts at the back. I just wanted to remind you at this time to turn off all your cell phones. We are recording this on video, and it will be available on YouTube after the meeting tonight. Kevin Mitchell is recording it. The views expressed tonight are those of the legislators and not of the League of Women Voters. The format for tonight is that this is a town hall where all the questions being asked tonight are from you, the audience. The questions have been submitted by email, and then we will also have time for the audience to come and ask questions of the legislators. And we've got a microphone set up at the center here, and we would ask that you line up along the side when you're going to ask your question. When you come up to ask your question, please state your name and your city or county of residence. State the topic of your question. And so that we can hear from as many of you as possible, questions are limited to 30 seconds in length. And then you may ask one 15-second follow-up question. We have timers for these questions. They are Mary Hansen and Manaya Lund sitting in the front here. And they will hold up a pink 10-second card to warn the audience members, and a red, oh, it's yellow, I guess, not pink, a yellow 15-second card to warn audience members, and then they have a red stop sign. The legislators will each have a minute and a half to respond to the questions. So tonight I would like to introduce our legislators. From District 4 in the Senate, we have Senator Kent Eakin. He is in his 15th year. He is from Twin Valley, and he and his wife have 4 children that range in age from middle school up to one that's now teaching high school. We also have our House Representative Paul Marquardt, who is in District 4B. He is from Dilworth, and he's in his 18th year in the House, and he has 2 children and 2 grandchildren. In an ongoing effort to provide nonpartisan opportunities for voters to hear from their elected officials, Senator Paul Utke and Representative Steve Green were invited but declined. However, they will have an event on Thursday, April 5th at 6:30 p.m. at the Frazee Fire Hall. And I would advise you to arrive early because there is very limited seating if you want to attend that event. So to open, I would like to just call on each of you to give us a 2-minute recap of the major focus of attention in the session thus far. And we'll start with Representative Marquardt.
So, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the League of Women Voters for hosting. Thank you for the City of Detroit Lakes for hosting this event. And you're always so generous, so I really appreciate that. And I do have a new grandson. Now I have a granddaughter, grandson, but you know, I'm a Democrat. His name is Lincoln Grant. So there you go. On the House floor, I made this announcement, and then I told everyone that I had cupcakes in the retiring room with blue frosting on it. So all these Republicans came across, said, well, with that name, he should have had red frosting. I said, this had to do with gender, not political party. That's why it's the blue frosting. But I do want to congratulate the City of Detroit Lakes. There's always something going on. This year, the Ice Palace, which was fantastic. And, you know, nothing's left to detail. I mean, even when the lighting that night, the song was cold as ice, you know, and so. But I was really thinking that you made a mistake. I think you could have kept it up through the water carnival, the way the winter's been going. So I think you took it down too soon. I actually think it could have been up there. So, well, we're mainly here to answer questions and so forth, but a couple big issues are going to be the bonding bill. There's going to be a tax bill we're going to have to talk about, some school safety things, senior elderly abuse, and so forth. But we can talk about those more as we go on. But again, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to represent this fine area.
Thank you. Go ahead, Senator.
All right, thank you. And I, too, would echo the same thoughts as far as my thanks to the League of Women Voters and the people of Detroit Lakes, and what an honor it is to serve you in the legislature. And as Representative Marquardt said, there's a number of issues that we're dealing with this year. Biggest one, I guess, is the bonding bill, since this is the bonding session. We did a big bonding bill last year as well, but that's because there wasn't a bonding bill the year before when there was supposed to be. So last year's bonding bill was really just finishing up unfinished business from the year before. Now we're continuing with the bonding bill this year. And some other issues that we're dealing with include MNLARS, the Minnesota licensing and registration system, which we've been having real problems with. It's been the rollout of it has been a disaster. It was designed to make getting your license or license tabs or getting a registration of a vehicle much more efficient and user-friendly. It's turned out that it was just the opposite. And we did allocate $10 million towards fixing that. They're saying it's going to cost more like $43 million, but we're not letting the money go that quickly. We're kind of keeping tighter reins on the process here as we move forward. Some other issues, already mentioned elder abuse, opioids, the epidemic that's growing in our state and in our country that needs to be addressed. There's a bill that's been proposed, and the governor has proposed having a penny per pill a bill or proposal that would require the companies making these drugs to pay a penny for each pill. So that's that would go into treatment and hopefully avoiding the abuse and the addictions that are coming from that. The transportation issue, funding for roads and bridges, there's also a constitutional amendment been proposed. On that front, we can talk about that later, but that's all I can say for now.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take a couple questions that we had submitted via email first, and then we'll ask for the audience participation. So, a constitutional amendment to fund highway and infrastructure improvements through an allocation of tax revenue is pending in the legislature. Could you explain the proposal and how that would impact the taxes we already pay? And we'll start with Senator Eakin.
Sure, and that was one of the things I just mentioned, the transportation amendment. It would divert funding from the general fund to a special fund dedicated to roads and bridges. Now, it would come from a sales tax on auto parts, on auto repairs, on rental vehicles. It's already a tax that's in place. It's existing funds that currently goes into the general fund. That's why it would simply divert those funds into a dedicated fund for roads and bridges. And it sounds like it makes sense. I mean, it obviously, auto parts and auto repairs, rentals and so on, that all goes towards roads and bridges. They're all, cars are used on roads and bridges, so it makes sense that taxes on such parts and such repairs would go onto roads and bridges. The problem with it is that it's taking from somebody else. And it's taking from children and their education. It's taking from long-term care services for seniors and people with disabilities. That's the concern that I have about it. I know advocates are saying, well, it just takes such a small percentage of the general fund budget, but that cut that it's going to lead to doesn't get spread over the whole general fund. It gets targeted. And one of the areas that seems to always get targeted is health and human services, which is mainly long-term care services for our most vulnerable citizens. So I have some real concerns about that. If we could backfill for that funding, I would be fine with it, but I'm not going to pit people against roads and bridges, especially our most vulnerable citizens against roads and bridges. We need to fund both.
Hey,
Yeah, just to add to that, that would bring in about $300 million, which is about half of the $600 million that everyone agrees on we need per year to really keep up with our transportation costs. And what I would like to see is a compromise, believe it or not, in that typically Democrats don't want to take money out of the general fund and use for transportation. And Republicans tend to not want to do a gas tax. So if we're going to get to $600 million, we've got to take some things we don't want. So as a Democrat, I would be willing to, do $200 million on the general fund, and then raise a gas tax 6 or 7 cents. That would get you to about 200 million, and then bond for 200 million. You'd actually bring everyone together because, as Senator Eakin mentioned, if you just take $300 million out of the general fund, and it's not new dollars, you're competing with local government aid, health care, education, all of these things. And things are going to get tighter into the future, not more lucrative. And so we've got to look at things, and the gas tax, for example, rural Minnesota pays 50% of that. It'd be a 50-50, yet we get back about 65% because of the formula. So let's do a real compromise where you got to take things neither side really want to do, but that's the only way we're really going to get to a solution. And what I don't want is people to think if they pass this constitutional amendment that they've solved the problem. That's only going to get you halfway there.
Can
Thank
I do
you.
a quick follow-up on that, or don't you have follow-ups?
Go ahead for a very short,
Sure. Well, I just
15 to
wanted
30
to point,
seconds.
I just want to point out that it's a good chance it's going to pass the legislature, and if it does, it's going to be on the ballot in November, where you'll have an opportunity to vote for it in November, and that's why it's an important one to really follow.
Okay, thank you. For our next question, rather than tax breaks, could that money in the Treasury be used to raise the pay of nursing home employees so that important jobs are treated with the dignity they deserve and will attract and keep people working at positions that are needed in the community? So we'll start with Representative Marquardt.
Well, absolutely, yes. It could be used for providers and so forth. And, I just saw, there's 9 daycare providers, for example. Just that situation, if you could up that cost, you could maybe keep daycare providers in town. But looking at health care and providing for seniors and that, that is a tough job. And I always say those who provide for our most vulnerable, we pay them for their minds and then they throw their hearts in for free, because that's the type. We've got to make sure we can fund that. And one issue we're looking at right now, because of the way the Department of Human Services is looking at things, is a potential 7% cut to a lot of our health providers that care for our most vulnerable. And so we've got to fix that. That would make a difference of a loss of about $10 million if we don't get this kind of glitch fixed. And what happened is, a few years ago, we approved about a 7% increase for providers. And the way the federal government is kind of interpreting this is they see it not as an increase on the base, but kind of a one-time funding. And so we're going to lose that funding unless we do some things, and we're working on that right now. But Senator Eakin's really been the champion in this area, so I'll let him respond on this too.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Paul, and it goes exactly to what I was talking about earlier as far as diverting resources away from things like long-term care for our most vulnerable. And yes, it could be used for increasing the pay of those who are providing care. And there's been a lot of talk recently about elder abuse and neglect and exploitation in long-term care facilities. I think it's important to note that there are bad apples. The Minneapolis Star-Trib did some articles on elder abuse cases. Unfortunately, they tend to paint the whole industry with one brush. There's a lot of good apples, too. We need to get the bad apples removed and taken care of, but we also want to keep the good apples and encourage and bring in more good apples. And that requires that we pay them what they deserve. And it is important work. It is hard work. And we need to pay them accordingly. And certainly taking more money out of the general fund, I think, jeopardizes that ability to pay them what they deserve. And you know, as far as the elder abuse, there's a lot of focus on regulations. And yes, regulations can be part of the solution, but we're not going to just regulate our way out of that problem. We need to focus on prevention of abuse and neglect, and that requires that we bring in good quality people into the profession in the first place. And so, yeah, we need to increase the pay. I've got a proposal for creating a dedicated fund for long-term care services, and I'm going to keep on pushing for that as we move forward this session.
Okay. At this time, we are going to take questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please come over here to the side, and then we'll take turns. It looks like you're the first one. You're the first one, so you can step up to the... It's okay. We just want to make sure you get some exercise and you're ready. So,
That's all right.
so just a reminder to state your name and where you live.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We appreciate it. Dave Golo, Frazee. Because we are co-sponsoring this, I am the secretary of the local chapter, the Smoky Hills chapter of the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association, and our group is also meeting tonight, preparing for an upcoming banquet. So anyway, here I am. You know, all of us, I think, are pretty much interested in conservation and make a good attempt to be a respectable sports people. Our big concern, as you know, in the deer hunters is habitat. All of you have seen these orange hide for habitat boxes around in the fall of the year, and what we do with those dollars is either develop habitat or hopefully purchase habitat. My question is, there's a movement now, I think, by some in the legislature to take either public lands and put them out for private sale, or to reduce the number of public lands that are out there. So my question is, what's your stance on the procurement or the keeping of public lands? I understand that if it goes in the private sector, that becomes taxable, but there's very little mention of payment in lieu of taxes ever on any of that stuff, even though that's kind of,
Okay.
So anyway, stop
Thank you.
now. Okay.
We'll start with Senator Eakin.
Yeah, and I do think that we have to be concerned about the loss of tax base and those issues that is leading to that legislation to be introduced. I think one thing that we need to do is make sure that any loss of tax base is being compensated for in the purchasing of those lands, if there is going to be any public purchasing of land. I do have concerns about overextending our ability to properly care for those lands. We already have a lot of public lands currently that the DNR is in charge of, and sometimes I think that we're not doing an adequate job of making sure we're taking care of the lands that we currently have. And so that is a concern. I think that we, and I don't know if this legislation is the answer to those issues. There's other ways to deal with the loss of property tax base. for a community. You mentioned the PILT payments. I don't think that they have been adequate, but there's other, we can increase the amount of compensation for those lost lands as well. But certainly, I certainly don't want to see us selling off like state park lands and things of that nature that have been so important to our quality of life here in Minnesota. But I think that we do have to be concerned that we're not biting off more than we can chew as a state as far as the amount of property that we're attaining. And Minnesota is one of the largest property owners in the nation. I remember when the DNR was testifying in front of our committee, this is a few years ago, and we were asking them about the lands that they have. I mean, the inventory is so large that I think they haven't been able to adequately, take care of those lands they have.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think we have to use balance on that. In fact, we just had a meeting earlier. We're meeting with a lot of township officials who are promoting something called no net loss or no net gain, and what that bill does basically says that if you buy land that takes land out of their tax base, it kind of goes into a trust, and then that trust helps pay back the taxes. I think that might be a good approach, but our state has always been a sporting state. That's part of our culture. So the wildlife habitat we need to continue to develop. And I just think, like most things, I don't think it has to be an either or. I think we can develop wildlife habitat and at the same time make sure that our townships that are concerned about losing tax base and so forth are compensated some way. It's not that difficult to do that. You can either beef up the PILT payments or this proposal of putting kind of the costs into a trust that comes back and pays for the lack of tax base and taxes can be. So I mean, too many times in the legislature, we get, as legislators, get put into a corner of having to do an either or, like it's always a win or lose. I don't think that's the case here, just as I was talking about the kind of how we should solve the transportation problem. So this, I just think, with a balance, making sure we promote the wildlife habitat, but you also have to make sure the townships aren't losing tax base. And we can do that. We can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hello,
Good evening.
Hi.
my name's Kyle Meacham. I have a question. Is there any way we can get more funding for employment services like Blue Sky? So people with mental health issues who might have trouble in the workspace, that like if you create a new waiver or something, then they could qualify for it, and then they could go and get help being moved in to a job if they were having troubles working. I heard about Mark Johnson's bill, and I'm not too much of a big fan of it, but I understand where he's coming from.
We'll start with Representative Marquardt.
You have a lot there in your question, which is really important. A couple issues there. One, we've got to make sure that folks that have disability of any sort have the opportunity to fulfill the best potential. That's working, doing what they would like to do. I mean, we have to make sure of that. There is, I think you're alluding to, there's a bill out there right now that would say that if you're going to qualify for Medicaid, that you have to be working. Well, able-bodied, I mean, I think everyone agrees with that, but it's what's in the details. And right now, if you're over 60, you're exempt from the bill, or under 18, you're exempt from the bill. But even Senator Johnson, who you mentioned, when they asked him about, okay, if someone has mental health disabilities or issues, do they qualify, or are they excluded, or are they going to lose their health care? And he even admitted he's got to go back and rework that. And that's my concern, is that folks who, for one way or the other, can't be fully gainfully employed, I don't want those folks losing their health care. And we have a lot of veterans, a lot of homeless veterans, and they're homeless because of either a physical or mental disability that incurred because of their service for our nation. And I just want to make sure that's clarified. I don't think anyone here disagrees that if you're able-bodied, you should be working or looking for work or going to school or whatever, but we've got to make sure that people don't get hurt in this. And that's not just some political soundbite that's geared for some election. when we're talking about people who can really be impacted by this. So thank you for bringing that.
Thank you.
Senator Eakin?
Yeah, and I believe that we were just talking earlier at another town hall meeting about the need for workers, and that's just going to continue to grow because of the baby boom generation leaving the workforce. So we need every available hand out there to fill that workforce void that's being created. And that includes, people who are experiencing difficulties with mental illness. I don't think that one should be, because of having mental illness, that they should still have an opportunity to find meaningful work. And you mentioned Blue Sky. I'd be interested to learn more about Blue Sky and other programs that are designed to help people with mental illness reach their full potential and be able to enter the workforce and find meaningful work. I think, being able to find meaningful work, it gives you a sense of purpose that I think is very important to one's mental health as well. So I think that's part of the process of improving one's mental health. So I'm definitely in favor of programs that will make that a reality, that will value the potential that every individual in our state has to offer, and doesn't discount a person just because of their mental illness or physical ailments, for that matter. I mean, we have opportunities that are available for everyone to find meaningful work in their life.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next.
My name is Willis Matson, and thank both of you gentlemen for making yourself available for these kinds of public meetings. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I want to ask you about your resolve to fend off what has become probably the greatest assault on Minnesota's regulatory framework protecting natural resources in the environment. Bills introduced by Representative Fabian, by Representative Green, by Senator Lewick and Garofalo will want to take apart the underpinning of Minnesota's rules and regulations protecting the environment. And I'm wondering if we can stand firmly protecting that which is most important to this part of the state, our forests and rivers and lakes and public lands. And in regard to the fellow from the Deer Hunters Association wanting to protect public lands, I would hope you would rethink your position that the DNR must be able to manage these public lands in order for them to be in public protection. Because as an ecologist, I can tell you that most forests take quite good care of themselves if you leave them
Mr.
alone.
Matson? Okay.
So
We'll let Senator Eakin
thank you very much.
respond.
Sure. And I don't know if you got to the specific question you wanted to ask.
Well, first of all, in regard to your stance to the bills that would undermine the regulations, it's been the DFL party's long time to protect environment and natural resource and conservation.
Sure.
And do you think there's sufficient unity amongst the Democrats and others that you might be able to join in fending off those kinds of attacks on these rules that have served us so well?
Well, I certainly think that we need to protect our public lands and protect our waters. I mean, it's the most precious natural resource that we have is our waters in our state and our public lands as well. So we do need to protect them. But I also think that we need to do it in an effective way. And sometimes I do have some concerns with some of the regulatory system that we have, that it doesn't utilize the financial resources we have in the most effective ways. And sometimes we have regulations that may cost a lot of money and have very little benefit. And I think that everyone would want to make sure that those resources are used wisely. And that's why I think that regulatory agencies need to take into consideration more the costs that are being imposed and whether or not the benefits derived from such regulations justify the costs that are being imposed. So I would favor having the state take on more responsibility for the costs of those regulations, because I think that would naturally result in using those resources more wisely and more effectively. because if you're paying the costs yourself, as we would at the state, you're going to want to make sure that you're using those resources wisely. But if you're imposing those costs on others, like the cities or the counties, or on the school districts, or on the farmers or the small businesses, you're not as concerned about the costs that you're imposing. So I think we need to do something to get the agencies to really look more closely at the costs being imposed in society.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those proposals, bypassing the Public Utility Commission, letting Enbridge decide on their own on the permit is extreme, and certainly wouldn't support that. But what Senator Eakins mentioned, I do think, again, there needs to be a little balance in this. You know, some of the, for example, City of Moorhead, you know, they're talking about what they can put into the Red River and so forth, and you know, this would be tens of millions of dollars. Little common sense has to be used, because you've got Fargo that doesn't have any restrictions going into the Red River also, and how much is that really going to improve things? Or like the case of the city of Detroit Lakes, you could talk to Vernell and city folks here about the extra things they had to do because the state just moved down a certain standard. And so there has to be a balance between, yes, I mean, you know, making sure water is clean and all those things, but you know, also looking at what the costs are and making sure the benefits are based on scientific studies. Now, I know last year there was a few law changes that shortened the amount of time, I think, to 150 days or something that they had to do a permit. I mean, some of these are going on and on and on and costing people all sorts of money when they should be able to come to a conclusion. And the other one had to do with kind of things based on science, and that it could go to a court. And I know there's a differing opinion, but I think, you know, as you kind of talk with folks, it's a balance again. And I just think we've got to look at the economics on some of these and make sure science is sound.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to talk really fast.
Your name?
Barb
Name and-
Faber. And Barb Faber. And I'm with Close the Gap by 5, and I'm from Becker County. Research, all the research in the last 25 years shows that the brain, for every child, 80% of their brain is developed from 0 to 3. And Dr. Todd Risley's work, Meaningful Differences, shows that children from middle to high income families arrive to kindergarten with 20,000 word vocabulary. Children from low income, especially children of color, are arriving with 3,000 to 4,000 word vocabulary. Minnesota is one of the states with the worst achievement gap. And Governor Dayton has done a lot of work, and we appreciate that. And but now it's the kind of the discussion is universal pre-K to early learning scholarships. So, and I know Senator Eakin, it's rural development, child care issues matter, and then Paul, you're on the education finance, so early learning scholarships.
Could you comment on that,
Yes.
Representative Marquardt?
Yeah, I support the universal voluntary pre-K. And I believe in a mixed system, which means it's giving parents the choice, you know. And so it may not all be in a school setting. It could be Head Start, could be a family daycare, it could be a church daycare system, a mixed delivery system that allows parents to decide. But we know, as you just said, that that is really important. And you talk to kindergarten teachers. And sometimes the gains made in pre-K don't follow through even to third grade. But what they have seen is that if you have a consistent curriculum all the way through third grade, then you see the gains. Rob, and to narrow the achievement gap is crucial. And that basically what he's talking about is the gap between white students and minority students or students of poverty. And that is going to be crucial, especially with our future workforce. That is going to be a lot of new people because of us baby boomers retiring, the growth in our labor force is very, very small. Rob Grunwald, who worked with the Minneapolis Reserve Bank, said if we could close the achievement gap, it would increase the productivity of our workforce by 2 to 3% of our GDP in the state. Now, you might not think that's huge, but it would be equivalent to an increase in our economy of $5 to $6 billion, which would equate to like building 5 Viking U.S. bank stadiums every year. That's significant. And so it is vital that we do that, and I do support that effort.
Go ahead.
And I likewise would support that effort, and I appreciate the information you're providing here, Barb, as far as the importance of early childhood, because that is when the brains are developing the fastest. And I thought that that was rather alarming when you were talking about the vocabulary of the students when they're starting school. At that point, you're already, you're already placing these students at a great disadvantage. So we need to reach them even earlier to make sure that they're starting at the same starting line. I mean, I'm reminded of somebody that was working on behalf of those with suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome and their parents, and they had told me that they thought we were doing things kind of backwards. We were going from kindergarten and pushing back to 4-year-olds and down to eventually working our way back. Whereas he said you should be starting off with prenatal and then working up from that, because those are the most critical stages in a child's development, and making sure first and foremost that they're born healthy and that they're provided with the health care that they need and a nurturing environment, the nutrition, health care, and everything that they need to be successful. And that is the way we should be looking at it. I think there was a lot of wisdom in that, and that you mentioned that it's from 0 to 3 is when 80% of the brain is developed. So even the 4-year-old programs is already long after a lot of that development has occurred.
Do I get 15
Yes, you can
seconds to
have a
respond?
follow-up.
Okay.
Follow-up question?
Thank you. Yeah, the early learning scholarships are flexible, and I find that the universal pre-K are not flexible, especially for working families, because it's on a calendar year, it's 3 hours a day, and so working families, if we want families to work, we need to support them, and getting them early learning scholarships, I think, is our best bet. The Minnesota model works, and I agree, Rob Grunwald is
Yeah.
very
Oh, yeah.
knowledgeable. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other audience members at this time?
I'm Ron Zeman. I live here in Detroit Lakes, and first of all, I want to thank both of you for all the help you've given Detroit Lakes this past year with grant money, especially for the sewer plant, but also for trails and everything else. You've done a great job for us. But my concern tonight is talking about the working poor and the need for affordable housing. And years past, we used to have programs from state and federal level, and those programs have kind of dried up. And what do you see down the road as far as getting help for low-income people? They're working hard, both husband and wife, but they still can't make enough money to buy a house. What do you see that we can do to help those people with programs like we had 20 years ago for affordable housing? Thank
We'll
you.
start with Senator Eakin.
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that the housing is available. So we need to be providing grants to programs to encourage the building of low-income, low-cost housing for those individuals. I think that there's a lot of momentum behind such initiatives, especially given the fact that many in the business community are promoting such legislation because they understand the importance of having enough workers in their community, and a community like Detroit Lakes, which is a growing community and has a lot of very successful growing businesses. It is absolutely critical that we have the housing infrastructure necessary to attract workers here. And when you're talking about starting jobs, they're not making a lot of money, so it has to be affordable housing. And so, the state needs to step up and provide incentives to build that housing, because the profit just isn't there for many of these companies to build the housing that's necessary. So the public, the state, plays a significant role in that. We have certainly recognized it at the state level. It's an issue across the state. We're finding more and more issues with this. And this is one area of the state that has especially been affected by that because of the growing businesses of this area. So I thank you for bringing that issue forward. It is a critically important issue for not just those that are looking for housing, but for the economic viability of our communities.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. I think, first of all, we've got to look at how we can create incentives for contractors, developers, and that to produce more affordable housing. In rural Minnesota, the cost of a house, they may never get that back. So you've got to provide some gap financing in there. And I know we do some of that with some of our housing programs, but we need to really ramp that up, especially in areas where you might have income below a certain level and so forth. I think there's also some tax programs. There's a working family credit that really helps families. It's kind of geared towards families, 40,000 income or less. I think there's some things we can do with taxes. As far as kind of employment, I'm switching things a little bit, but I want to throw out an idea because you see so many employers right now, and it's a tight economy, but they're looking for electricians and welders and plumbers and air conditioning, all these things, and there's such a shortage. What if, and Mr. Froke, pay attention to this now, really, is that what if we merged our technical colleges back into the high schools and made sure that when you graduate, you had a skill set that matched the needs of your local employers? And a lot of schools are kind of doing this. You'd almost get maybe an associate degree before you left school. But there's been such a focus in the past on the four-year degree, that we don't have the job set to fulfill a lot of those jobs out there. And that might be one way to do it. So we'll have to talk more on that philosophy.
Thank you. Any other audience members that have a question?
Terry Khalil, League of Women Voters Minnesota, and rural Becker County resident. I had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago to hear Secretary of State Steve Simon talk over in Park Rapids about election security. And I heard a lot of words that I'm not used to hearing in joined sentences about Minnesota. We know we have the highest voter turnout in the nation. I heard about Russia, secret clearance that he had to get, attempted cyber hacks, outdated equipment. Going into this election season, what is the legislature going to do to make sure that when we all go vote in August and November, yes, Mary, I see the stop sign. You make the rules and then you get caught breaking them. What is the legislature going to do to make sure that when we vote, every vote counts in November? Thank you.
Representative Marcourt.
You know, quite frankly, I don't know the current efforts, and maybe the senator does. I'm not on that committee to see if there's specific efforts. However, I have talked with Secretary of State Steve Simon, used to be a fellow colleague, and he's very concerned about this. So I don't know exactly the mechanics of it, but we do know the most important thing we have in society is to make sure that our elections are fair, honest, and free, and that everyone knows it's all above board. So if you ever have any idea that something might be tainted or not accurate, you lose democracy. Ultimately, the foundation of it would crumble because that's what it relies on, knowing that you're electing officials in a fair, honest, transparent system. So, I know in this day and age with the more cyber out there and so forth, I know it has to be done. I don't know for sure, Terry, exactly what is being done as far as specific laws, and maybe the senator knows that.
Yeah, and I don't serve on the committees that deal specifically with those issues either, but I do know that the federal government needs to do more in that regard because the states can't do it themselves. We're talking about a threat to our country that comes from a foreign power that obviously requires the national government to be involved in, and that requires utilizing and mobilizing the tools at the federal level, including of the CIA and the FBI. But at the state level, we need to do all we can as well. One of the benefits of our system is that we have a very diffuse system of elections. It's run by individual states. That's actually a good thing. It's much harder for a country like Russia to invade our systems with cyber attacks because it is so diffuse and it's so difficult for them to get into. I had concerns when there were proposals to kind of centralize the voters' rolls in Washington. It's better to have them dispersed throughout the country. And I know that Secretary of State Steve Simon is certainly understands the importance of that and protecting the integrity of our election system here. We've done a very good job in Minnesota, but we need help from the federal level. There's no way around that. You know, we were talking about some of the problems with MNLARS and some of the computer problems we're having. I mean, we need to really get out ahead of the computer technology necessary to protect our election infrastructure from invasion from outside forces.
Seeing that there are no more audience questions, I do have one more question that came in via email. At this time, when President Trump and the Secretary of Education are planning on slashing the education budget, should Minnesota not be fully funding public education for its students? The state's share of funding schools hasn't kept pace with inflation. It is 10% less than 2003 in real dollars. Do you anticipate the legislature increasing school funding in this or the next session? So we'll start with Senator Eakin.
Yeah, and the governor has proposed some increased funding for pre-K, certainly looking at that, and also for higher education. This is not a budget year, so we're not going to see, you know, a significant increase in funding for anything. I mean, other than what we have in that surplus, which is a pretty small percentage of the general fund budget. So it'll be next year that we're going to see the next round for the big budget bills. And I do think that education needs to be priority. It's the number one reason we enjoy such a high quality of life here in Minnesota compared to other states. And you mentioned the cutbacks from the federal government. The fortunate thing is that most of the funding for education comes from the states. You know, and most of the policies comes from the states. Again, it's really the states that run our education system, you know, all the way from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, and our college and university system as well. So that's really an issue, again, that we deal with. And we've always taken great pride in Minnesota in being a land of opportunity that leaves no one behind and provides every child with an opportunity to develop to their fullest potential. And that means that we at least keep up with inflation, which we haven't been doing. We have been slipping and falling behind. We want to maintain our position as a leader in the nation when it comes to education. So I feel that we need to do more in the next budget year, which is next year, to make sure that we're going beyond just treading water and keeping up with inflation. We need to be making new investments, and I think especially in early childhood.
Thank you. Representative Marquardt.
That's a tough one. We spend about $18 billion every 2 years on education. It's about 41% of the budget. That's K through 12 or pre-K through 12. And just to increase funding for education 2%, like each of the next 2 years, which we did, is about $370 million. And if we were to do a 3%, it'd be $540 million. So I don't know if we're going to be able to keep up with inflation. And with the current way things are, I mean, you also have, as Senator Eakins mentioned, Health and Human Services, which is now up to 30% of the budget. And greatly, it's the fastest growing area of the budget. And so we've got to look at doing things differently. I mean, we really do, because we're kind of on an unsustainable path. And I'm a strong supporter of education. It's crucial. But just with kind of the way things are in the budget, it's going to be difficult to keep up with inflation. It really is. We don't have the money to do that. I think we've got to make sure we target our dollars, and I think the earlier we target the dollars, the better dollar we get in the end as far as long-term outcomes. And one thing we haven't talked about, but there's going to be, I think what's going to get funded this year is for safe school initiatives, not only for school resource officers and mental health counselors, but also facilities, which could be just strengthening locks on classroom doors or securing entrances and that type of thing. And everyone agrees that that's going to get done this year.
Thank you. Since there are no more questions. Okay. Mr. Zeman has one more question.
It's a concern with public safety involving our cars, and it seems that this last year there's been an overabundance of accidents because of the cell phone and also because of drinking. And I'm just wondering what's happening in St. Paul in regards to repeat offenders of drinking all the time, and also with all the texting that we're doing.
Representative Marcourt.
Well, it's against state law to text and drive, and I know folks are still doing it. And so I don't know. As far as drinking and driving, Senator Eakin and I have drinking and driving. Senator Eakin and I have a bill. It actually came forward to us when a young man by Ada was killed by a drunk driver a couple falls ago. And so this would increase the penalty to 25 years. Right now in Minnesota, it's 10 years, and every state around us has a much stiffer penalty than that. This would raise it to 25 years for vehicular criminal homicide. Also, as part of that bill, because just having the penalty doesn't necessarily, people have to know about it. So in that bill, we've increased funding for the Department of Public Safety to increase awareness of that. And then a third component of the bill would be that in school driver safety classes, you would also have to emphasize the penalties that go with drinking and driving and criminal vehicular homicide and so forth. So it's serious.
Would you like to add to that?
Sure. One thing that's been proposed, I know there's proposals addressing drinking and driving of snowmobiles and boats and ATVs as well, and basically applying the same penalties to that as you would to driving a car under the influence. So that's something else that's being looked at. I think that was spurred on by a tragic accident involving a young boy that was killed. I think they were on a lake and he was hit by a snowmobile by a person that was intoxicated. So that's an issue. You mentioned the talking on cell phones and texting as well. I know there is also a proposal for a hands-free bill that would require talking on the phone would have to be hands-free, and there is technology available. It is rather amazing the technology that they have now. And I think the most dangerous part of talking on cell phones isn't actually the talking itself. It's the dialing and trying to find the number on the phone that creates the distraction that often leads to serious accidents and sometimes tragically fatal accidents. And this new technology enables a person to call somebody by simply saying, call so-and-so. You don't even have to find the number or anything. So there is technology out there, and which is important because a lot of people do business on the phone while they're driving and so on, and this technology makes it possible to do it more safely, and so it's something that I hope really starts to catch on.
Thank you.
In talking about the DWIs,
Can you state your name, please?
Sure, I can. My name is Steve Todd, and I'm the Chief of Police here in Detroit Lakes. In talking about the DWIs, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this bill that's currently in, which is the forfeiture bill. And as a head of a law enforcement agency, I'm really opposed to it. Minnesota has been a leader in DWI enforcement for the past 20 years, and we've made huge strides in cutting down the numbers of DWIs. And as I see it as a leader in law enforcement, this forfeiture bill is really going to cut us off at the knees at hampering these repeat offenders from continuing to drive. As you know, our current statute allows us to forfeit vehicles for habitual offenders, and this bill would inhibit those forfeitures. If you could talk a little bit about that. One comment real quick. I did reach out to Mr. Marquardt about this. He answered my email under 2 hours later in the evening, and I just want to thank him for his accessibility.
Okay, Senator Eakin, we'll let you comment first.
Yes, and I oppose the bill, the forfeiture bill that is coming forward. I agree with you that I think it does undercut law enforcement and their ability to deter the drunk driving, repeat drunk driving that occurs out there. As far as its chances, I've also talked to, there are just one other law enforcement officer over in Hawley that was bringing this up as well, and Ben Fall over in Twin Valley. So we've talked to a number of officers who are all in agreement that this is not good legislation. And also that the money would be sent to the state, as I understand it, and money that really should be staying with the local communities and helping them to fray the expenses that are incurred by the local law enforcement. So I'm going to be opposing that legislation. I haven't heard of any movement yet in the Senate. I think there's probably been more movement occurring over on the House side on that bill, but
Well, first of all, Chief Todd, thank you for bringing that forward. And I am opposed, just know that. And I don't think people quite who are proposing that and supporting it quite understand how that works and what the money's used for and so forth. They just don't understand. It might be a metro rural thing, I don't know. But what Chief Todd just mentioned, I think is an excellent example, and I think for everyone here is that I'm on tax committee and education committee. So you ask me anything about what's going on in taxes and education, I can tell you. But I was not even aware of this bill until Chief Todd contacted me. So, I mean, so the bottom line, don't assume we know anything as legislators. No, I mean, we're wrapped up in this, and these bills, until they really become headlines, you may not know they're out there. So that was very, very helpful. And then besides that, Chief Todd gave me a name of another legislator that was working on this, and I talked to him and so forth. So just for all the groups, don't assume that we know necessarily about this bill. And so that was the first I had heard of it. And I think it's kind of the first a lot of people that aren't on the Public Safety Committee are hearing about it. And while there's some momentum right now, when talking to Representative Zerwas right before the Easter break, I think now the opposition is forming and as legislators. And we're going to fight that one because we know how it's used here and the importance. But again, thank you for bringing that forward.
Mr. Mattson has another question.
Yes, Willis Mattson. I'm going to put a different hat on. I'm a member of the Prairie Woods chapter of the Isaac Walton League, and something that our league has been challenging is the proposal to increase the amount of forests, cords of wood taken out of public forests in the state from 100 million to 120 million. And we question that from the standpoint of sustainability of the forests, as well as the fact that as a private forest owner myself, I find myself in competition with the state. The state puts more wood on the market, driving the price I can get for my forest trees when I turn down. As farmers, I think you might object if the state started raising corn and beans and put it on the market, driving the price of corn and beans down. So I'm wondering what your position is on that proposal that would force the DNR to increase the cordage of wood taken off public forests.
Representative Marquardt?
I'd like to refer to my last answer, assume we don't know anything. I'm not aware of that, and other than what you've just said, Willis, I just don't understand. I mean, I just can't give you a good answer right now, but I do appreciate what you're saying and the competition with the state and so forth, but I don't know what the reasoning is behind it and so forth. So I just have to say that at this point, just without giving you a position.
Yep.
Okay.
Senator
Okay.
Eakin?
Well,
okay, yeah.
You-
Well, and I'm similar to Representative Marquardt. I don't serve on the committees that deals directly with those issues. I hadn't heard about it until you just brought it up. I'd be interested to learn more about it. And so certainly talk to me afterwards offline here and we can, but I understand the concerns. I certainly, having been brought up on a farm, wouldn't like it either if the government started competing with me and driving the prices of our commodities down. But so thank you for the input.
Barb?
Hi, Barb Faber, Becker County. On a different note, almost, there are childcare deserts in Minnesota, especially in greater Minnesota. And I know there's a lot of questioning around regulatory issues of childcare providers. And I know that there's been a lot of childcare providers down testifying about the regulatory issues. And I think they're not telling, or that's a few and far between. And I don't believe the regulatory issues are as bad as just the few that have gone down there. And so if we want to support quality childcare, I guess I'm asking you, what are your thoughts?
Sure.
So go ahead, Senator Eakin.
Yeah, and we certainly want quality childcare. I mean, that's very important, you know, and I think, you know, the programs that we've had out there have been, you know, quite successful. The four-star program that we've had in place, and we need to continue encouraging, you know, these child care providers to improve the quality of the care that they provide. But I do think there is some legitimacy to the regulatory concerns that are being expressed as well. I know that, you know, again, the regulations, and this is really something that can apply generally, when just talking about regulations generally. They've been written from the metropolitan perspective, and they don't fit well in the rural areas of Minnesota. They don't fit well with the smaller operations, the smaller towns, the smaller businesses, and the smaller child care providers. It's very difficult to comply with some of the regulations that are being imposed, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration, the negative impact that it may be having on some of our smaller communities. So I think that we need to attack the problem of the child care deserts, as you called them, which I think, you know, we living in a desert out here because it's so difficult to find. And it's not just a problem for the families trying to find childcare, it's a problem for the businesses trying to find workers because parents have to stay home. And I've heard stories too of parents who are not having children for years because, or couples who are not having children because of the lack of childcare. I mean, that shouldn't be happening. And so I think, you know, regulations is one issue that we need to look at, but I also think we need to look at funding for CCAP and to make sure that we're providing the funds necessary to achieve good quality childcare, as you said. I think that more important than the regulatory side of it is having incentive type programs that incentivizes good quality childcare.
Yeah, and I agree with Senator Eakin said, and I would just add that I saw a story where there's 9 daycare facilities in Detroit Lakes going out of business here now or into the future. So I've talked to a few of the daycare providers, and they do talk about the regulations. And let me just give you one example that I'm working on is if a daycare provider needs a substitute to fill in for a part of a day or a whole day, right now that substitute has to get a background check for each and every different daycare person they're providing. So they may have to have several. And why not just one through the county or whatever and they're served? So just small things like that. But I think it represents kind of the over redundancy, if that's even a word, of kind of the regulations they have to go through. Or if you're a substitute, before you kind of get into the next category of doing all sorts of requirements and so forth, is that you can only substitute 30 times in a year, but that could be 31 hours. So if someone just comes in for one, that counts as your, rather than a day or something like that. So maybe it should be more hours or a certain amount, and I'm kind of working on that issue too. But it's serious, as Senator Eakin says. I mean, this is huge for people finding daycare, and it's crucial because we also want people into the workforce and not feeling I can't work because I've got to stay home because I can't find daycare.
Thank you.
So would you entertain a task force that would be made up of rural child care providers, licensors, tribal providers to look at the issue? Because I think there are some like you said, issues that are relevant, but then, you know, reducing regulation is never a good idea, but I think that the state needs to look at what issues are burdensome to those providers and unpack it. You got to unpack it. You can't just, you know, cut it out, but I think it's things to be looked at.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware, there was a task force that had met for the last couple of years and proposed a number of proposals last year. So I don't know who was I was not on it, but there was a task force. I think Representative Franson was leading that up, but I don't know who all were the memberships. I don't know if it included everyone that you just mentioned, but I know there was a task force that looked at that and actually had a number of bills last year that came forward.
Okay, well, I'd be happy to visit with you afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Glad.
Thank you.
I think in wrapping up here,
One more, please.
okay.
A very, very controversial issue. What do you think is going to happen in the state legislature in terms of firearms? And you don't have to sugarcoat it. I'm not an NRA member. I don't own, I never will own a semi-automatic weapon, but you see anything coming forward in the future?
I don't see anything coming forward this year. I mean, everything that is not past the committee deadline, so I don't see any changes. And there was actually proposals on both sides. Those that would restrict gun ownership and those that would expand it. And I think people on both sides ended up saying, we're not going to push either direction. That was kind of the lay of the land.
And in the
Yeah.
Senate?
And the
Similar?
same thing in the Senate. I think it's a similar situation. I don't see anything moving forward on that front, although, you know, the school safety issue, definitely a lot of focus on that. That's one area where we can get some bipartisan agreement, which is necessary because we have a divided government between Governor Dayton, the Democrat, and the governor's mansion, and the Republicans in control of the House and the Senate.
Okay. So in wrapping up, if there are any topics that we haven't brought up that you would like to address, we'll give each of you a minute and a half to sort of wrap up. So why don't we start with Representative Marquardt? And you might have had other questions today and you're driving around your area.
Well, just thank you again for hosting this, and it's always nice to be here. Like all of you, you all love your children and your grandchildren, and I love my grandchildren, Addison and Lincoln, and you know, you think about into the future, you know, what things are going to be like and how you can make it best. And you know, I know this sounds kind of corny, but it's so true, is that too many times people, not so much on the state level as even the federal, they always look at who's right or who's wrong, when all of you here want to know who can do better. That's what you really want. And you know, how can you do better in education or childcare or the environment or any of these issues that we've mentioned? And one thing that you've got to really force your legislators and any of your elected officials to do it is not get into this right or wrong or this side or this side. There isn't a single issue out there that we can't come together on. But too many times we just tend to focus, you know, it's teachers versus the administration, or unions versus the employer, or environmentalists versus the farmers, or whatever that might be. And everyone wants the same goals. And really focus on your legislators, whoever they might, I guess maybe everyone in the room is us. But to make sure that you're actually focusing on solutions and not who's right or who's wrong. I mean, I'm not saying I've never played that political game. It doesn't get you anywhere. And we're at the point right now that things are becoming so discombobulated that if you don't really put a focus on what is better rather than who's right or wrong, we're not going to move forward and make things better for our kids and our grandchildren. And that's the bottom line. And we're all in this together, so I do really appreciate your attendance, but also your comments along the way. And make sure you get a hold of me and Kent on issues, because we might not know they're going on, but it's great to hear your opinion. But again, thank you so much, and Merry Christmas. No, it's not Christmas, is it? It's Easter season, but it looks like Christmas out there, so thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay,
So-
Senator?
Oh, thank you. And and again, thank you all for being here tonight. It is, again, such an honor to serve you, and want you to know that you can contact us anytime. It's important for us to hear from you, and so I appreciate the input that we've gotten tonight. As far as you know, what's been happening at the state level, I do think that there's a lot more potential for common ground to be found at the state level than there has been out in Washington. Washington's been quite dysfunctional, but I think that we have found some good common ground solutions, and we've been able to make it work, a divided government, and I think that's important. Areas that I still think that we need to do much more on in the area of healthcare, especially having Minnesota Care buy-in. That did get a vote last year in the Senate. It failed by one vote. There's 2 medical doctors in the Senate. One's a Republican, one's a Democrat. Both voted for the Minnesota Care buy-in. I think it speaks to the credibility of that program, that the 2 medical doctors from 2 different parties both agreed that that's something that we need to pursue. So we're going to continue pushing on that to provide more options for people out here. And then long-term care. The last thing, just want to mention that we need to continue doing more on that. I'm going to continue pushing on the constitutional amendment to create a dedicated fund for long-term care services to meet the growing demands because of the baby boom generation, fast approaching years when they're going to need those services. And we do have constitutionally dedicated funding for a variety of other things, including clean water, wildlife habitat, public broadcasting, history centers, the arts, for roads and bridges, parks and trails, but we have nothing in the Constitution for our most vulnerable citizens. And if anybody needs constitutionally protected and dedicated funding, it's our most vulnerable citizens.
I do want to thank each of you for your time tonight. I know you've had a long day today, but let's give them a round of applause for. Thank you. I also want to thank Kevin Mitchell for providing all the technical expertise. The video of tonight's legislative town hall will be posted on YouTube. You can check the League's Facebook page for the link. I want to thank you, the audience members, for your attendance and for your questions. I want to thank the City of DL for hosting this here at City Hall. And I want to make 3 quick announcements. Tomorrow night, there is a citizens committee that's hosting a meeting to help the school district find a solution to their space problems. It's a citizens committee. It's not the school district or the school board. This meeting will be tomorrow evening at 6:30 p.m. at the high school library. And then I want to remind you that on Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m., Representative Steve Green and Senator Paul Utke will be at the Frazee Fire Hall, and that begins at 6:30 on Thursday. And then our next League of Women Voters meeting, which is open to the public to come as a guest if you choose, is on Tuesday, April 17th, 5 o'clock at La Barista. And Dr. Karen Brandon, who is a professor at MSUM, will be speaking on diversity, and the public is welcome. So once again, thank you all for attending tonight, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Bart. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
For you? Yep. Good to see you too.